Have you ever caught yourself rehearsing what you're about to say before you've even spoken? Running the sentence through your mind twice, 3 times, softening a word here, removing an edge there, until it sounds safe enough to release into the room. Have you ever stayed silent, not because you had nothing to say, but because somewhere beneath your ribs a quiet voice warned you, they might not like this version of you? Sit with that for a moment. Let it settle into your chest the way cold water settles into the bottom of a glass. Most people believe they are living their own lives. They wake, they work, they speak, they choose, and they call all of it freedom. But what if every major decision you have ever made, the job you chose, the person you stayed with, the dream you quietly buried, the words you swallowed at the dinner table, what if all of it was shaped not by who you are but by the fear of being seen wrong? What if your personality, the very thing you call yourself, is not your true self at all, but a mask? A mask built slowly, patiently, and visibly across years of small surrenders. A mask constructed not to express you, but to protect you from the judgment of a world that never asked permission to shape you in the first place. Here is the frightening truth, the one most people spend their entire lives avoiding. The more you chase approval, the further you drift from the person you were meant to become. Every yes you gave when your body screamed no, every laugh you performed when your soul stayed silent, every opinion you diluted so it would not disturb the room, each one was a small betrayal. And small betrayals repeated daily do not stay small. They accumulate, they calcify, until one day you look in the mirror and do not recognize the stranger staring back. In this video, we are going to walk into that hidden psychological prison together, the prison built from other people's opinions. We will look at why comparison quietly steals your identity, thread by thread, until nothing original remains, and we will discover how true freedom does not begin when the world finally accepts you. It begins the instant you stop asking the world who you are and start asking yourself. Because the greatest prison was never made of walls, or bars, or locked doors. The greatest prison is made of glances you were never brave enough to ignore. Let's begin. Carl Jung once wrote that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. What he meant was this: the forces shaping you the most powerfully are the ones you cannot see. And there is no force more powerful, more silent, more relentless than the hunger for approval. It begins earlier than you think. Long before you had language to describe it, you were already learning the rules. A child does not arrive in this world performing for an audience. A child cries when it needs to cry, laughs when something is funny, reaches for what it wants without apology. There is no mask yet, there is only presence. But watch what happens next. Watch closely, because this is where the invisible architecture begins to rise. The child cries, and a parent, exhausted, distracted, wounded in their own ways, responds with frustration instead of comfort. The child learns, in a language older than words, that certain feelings are unwelcome. The child speaks an honest thought at the dinner table, and the room goes quiet, and a subtle correction follows. The child learns that honesty has a cost. The child expresses excitement, too loud, too much, too free, and is told to calm down, to be smaller, to take up less space. None of this requires cruelty. Most of it happens inside ordinary, loving households, delivered by parents who themselves are simply repeating patterns handed down to them by their own frightened parents. But intention does not change the outcome. Layer by layer, moment by moment, the child begins constructing a second self, a self designed not for living but for surviving approval. By the time you reach adolescence, this second self has a name, though you never consciously chose it. Psychologists call it the persona, a term Jung borrowed deliberately from the ancient theater, where actors wore masks to represent the characters they played. Your persona is the mask you learned to wear so well that you forgot it was ever a mask at all. It became, in your own mind, simply you. Here is what makes this so dangerous. A mask worn briefly, consciously, for a specific purpose is simply a tool. An actor removes the mask after the performance and returns to himself. But a mask worn every single day, for years, without ever being examined, without ever being lowered, does something far more sinister. It begins to feel like skin. Think of the cost hiding beneath this. Somewhere inside you exists a version of yourself who has genuine desires, genuine opinions, a genuine rhythm of living that belongs to no one else. And somewhere along the way, that version was quietly moved into a back room and told to wait. Told that when the audience finally approves, when the applause is loud enough, when the judgment finally stops, then, only then, will it be safe to come out. That day never arrives. It cannot arrive because the approval you are chasing was never actually about you. It was about the fears, the insecurities, the unresolved wounds of everyone whose opinion you have been quietly obeying. You have spent years trying to satisfy an audience whose standards shift depending on their own unhealed pain. An impossible performance for an audience that was never truly watching as closely as you believed. Let that sink into you slowly. Now look closer at the mask itself, because it is more sophisticated than most people realize. It is not simply dishonesty. It is not simply pretending. The mask is intelligent. It adapts. It has different faces for different rooms. The version of you at work is not identical to the version of you with old friends, which is not identical to the version of you online, curated, filtered, edited into a shape that photographs well and offends no one. Every one of these versions serves the same underlying function: protection. The mask exists because somewhere at some point being fully yourself resulted in pain, rejection, ridicule, or simply the quiet withdrawal of love. And the nervous system, brilliant and merciless in its logic, concluded something simple and devastating. Being yourself is dangerous. Performing is safe. But performance has a hidden invoice, and it arrives eventually, always. The cost is a slow erosion of the felt sense of who you are. Ask yourself honestly, when was the last time you made a decision, a real decision, without silently calculating how it would be perceived? When was the last time you said something difficult, simply because it was true, without softening it into a shape more comfortable for the listener? If the answer troubles you, you are not broken. You are simply awake enough, in this moment, to notice the architecture you have been living inside. Now consider comparison, because comparison is the mechanism that keeps this prison locked from within. You were not born comparing yourself to anyone. Comparison is learned, trained into you by a society that measures worth through visible milestones, arranged neatly along an invisible timeline everyone is expected to follow without question. Graduate by this age, marry by this age, earn this much by this year, own this by that decade. And if you fall behind this imaginary schedule, a schedule no one ever actually agreed to, you are taught to feel shame, as though your unique path through life were a failure rather than simply your path. Here is what almost no one tells you: the timeline was never real. It was constructed, generation after generation, by people who were themselves terrified of falling behind a timeline handed to them. You have spent years measuring your life against a ruler built from other people's fear, and calling the resulting anxiety your own personal failure. Every person grows at a different rhythm. Some bloom early and burn out. Some remain unseen for decades before their moment arrives, fully formed, undeniable. Nature itself does not apologize for this. An oak tree does not compare its pace to a sunflower. It simply grows according to its own hidden clock, indifferent to seasons it cannot control. And yet you, a creature of far greater complexity than any tree, have allowed a stranger's Sunday afternoon photograph to convince you that your entire life is somehow behind schedule. We are going to go deeper into this in a moment, into the fear of judgment itself, and the uncomfortable discovery that the harshest critic you have ever faced was never actually out there in the world. It has been living inside you the entire time, wearing the borrowed voice of everyone who ever made you feel small. But before we continue, sit with everything we have uncovered so far. The mask you mistake for yourself. The timeline that was never real. The applause that was never actually the point. Ask yourself quietly, honestly, in the silence beneath this sentence: if no one was ever watching, who would you actually be? Sit with that question a moment longer, because it is not rhetorical, it is a door. And most people spend their entire lives standing in front of that door, hand hovering near the handle, never quite willing to turn it. Here is why the question feels so unbearable. We assume the fear of judgment comes from outside us, from the raised eyebrow across the room, from the comment left beneath a photo, from the silence that follows an unpopular opinion. But look closer, closer than you have ever dared to look, and you will find something unsettling. The sharpest criticism you have ever received was rarely spoken by another human being at all. It was generated internally, in a voice so familiar you stopped recognizing it as a voice that sounds suspiciously like every disappointed tone you absorbed in childhood, stitched together into a single relentless narrator that never sleeps. This is what Jung called facing the shadow. Not the villain hiding beneath your bed, but the disowned parts of yourself, the fears, the shame, the buried belief that you are somehow not enough, exiled long ago into the basement of your own mind because they were too uncomfortable to carry in daylight. And here is the cruel irony. The parts of yourself you refuse to look at do not disappear simply because you stopped looking. They wait. They grow teeth in the dark. And they speak to you constantly, disguised as the opinions of others. When someone criticizes you and it wounds you for days, replaying on a loop at 3 a.m, it is rarely the criticism itself that cuts so deep. It is because the comment brushed against a wound you had already been carrying, quietly, for years, a fear you already half believed about yourself before they ever said a word. Other people's opinions do not have power over you because they are true. They have power over you because they echo something you have not yet made peace with internally. This is the moment where most self-help content stops, offering you a comforting slogan and moving on. We are not going to stop there, because the real work, the work that actually changes a life, requires you to turn toward that inner voice instead of away from it. Not to silence it violently, not to drown it in noise and distraction, but to sit with it, the way you might sit across from a frightened child, and finally ask it what it is actually afraid of. Most of the time, beneath the surface bravado of that inner critic, you will find something startlingly simple. A fear of being unlovable if fully seen. A fear that your true thoughts, your true desires, your true pace of growth would be too much or not enough for the people whose approval you learned to need before you were old enough to question needing it. You cannot out-argue this fear with logic. You cannot silence it with willpower alone. There is only one path through it, and it terrifies most people more than the fear itself. Solitude. Real silence. Not the silence of a quiet room while your phone glows nearby, waiting to fill the gap the moment discomfort rises. Not the silence of falling asleep to a podcast so your own thoughts never quite reach you. True solitude, the kind where there is nothing left to perform for. No audience, no mirror, no metric, no notification. Just you and whatever surfaces when the noise finally stops. This is precisely why silence feels unbearable to so many people. It is not boredom they are avoiding, it is exposure. Because in true silence, the mask has nowhere left to perform, and for the first time in years, you might catch a glimpse of the face beneath it. For some people, that glimpse is terrifying. For others, it is the first honest breath they have taken in a decade. Modern life has engineered an escape from this confrontation with astonishing precision. Every idle second is filled before discomfort can even rise, a video, a scroll, a notification, a distraction disguised as connection. And so an entire generation moves through life having never once sat, fully alone, fully present, long enough to ask itself the only question that actually matters. Not what does the world want from me, but what do I actually want beneath every layer of conditioning I have inherited. Building a relationship with yourself is not a metaphor. It is a practice, the same as building trust with another human being. You would not expect a stranger to open up to you after a single rushed conversation, and yet most people expect instant clarity from themselves after 5 minutes of forced stillness, become uncomfortable when nothing profound arrives immediately, and return to the noise, concluding that solitude simply is not for them. Trust with yourself is built the same way trust is built with anyone, through consistency, through showing up, again and again, even when nothing dramatic happens. Sit in silence daily, even for 10 unremarkable minutes. Ask yourself simple, honest questions and resist the urge to answer too quickly with the socially acceptable response. What do I actually feel right now, underneath what I think I am supposed to feel? What have I been avoiding? What decision have I been quietly postponing because I already know the honest answer, and the honest answer is inconvenient? Slowly, without announcement, without fanfare, something begins to shift. Not because the world became less judgmental, it did not, but because you began developing something far more valuable than the approval you were chasing. An inner compass. An inner compass does not point toward what will be applauded. It points toward what is true for you, regardless of applause. This is the difference between motivation and discipline that almost no one explains clearly. Motivation is borrowed energy, dependent on external circumstances, external encouragement, external validation, and like anything borrowed, it must eventually be returned, leaving you empty when it goes. Discipline built from an inner compass requires none of that. It moves you forward on quiet mornings when no one is watching, when no one will ever know, because the action itself, aligned with something true inside you, has become its own reward. This is what it means to act from personal meaning instead of recognition. To write the page not because it will be praised, but because leaving it unwritten would betray something you have decided matters more than comfort. To have the difficult conversation not because it will be liked, but because silence has become more painful than honesty. To walk your own timeline, at your own pace, not because you have given up on growth, but because you have finally stopped measuring your growth using someone else's borrowed ruler. Daily habits reinforce this stability far more than grand gestures ever could. A morning without immediately reaching for outside noise. A boundary held even when it disappoints someone. A private commitment kept, seen by no one, known only to you. Each one is a small deposit into a form of self-trust that external validation could never purchase, no matter how loud the applause eventually becomes. And this leads us finally to the quiet frontier almost no one reaches. Emotional independence. Not coldness, not isolation, not the abandonment of relationships or love or connection. Emotional independence simply means your sense of worth no longer rises and falls with someone else's opinion of you. You can be criticized without collapsing. You can be misunderstood without abandoning yourself in a desperate attempt to be understood. You can walk into a room full of people who do not approve of your choices and remain unmistakably still yourself. This is not arrogance. It is not the absence of care for others. It is the presence of a self so rooted, so quietly anchored in its own truth, that external weather no longer determines the internal climate. You begin living from inner alignment instead of public approval, and something remarkable happens. The relationships in your life do not weaken, they deepen. Because for the first time, the people around you are finally meeting the real you, not the exhausted performance you had been offering them for years out of fear. The freedom on the other side of this is quiet. It does not arrive with fireworks or a dramatic before and after. It arrives the way morning arrives, slowly, undeniably, until one day you notice the tightness in your chest that used to appear before speaking your true opinion has simply gone. And this brings us to the truth. This entire journey has been circling from the very beginning. The greatest transformation you will ever undergo is not becoming someone new. It was never about becoming someone new. It is about remembering who you were before the world, with all its fears and expectations and inherited timelines, told you who to be. That person has been waiting, patiently, quietly, in the room you exiled them to all those years ago. When being fully yourself first felt dangerous, they are still there. And the door was never locked from their side. It was only ever locked from yours.